Absolute and relative surplus value, which implies that the totality of value produced in the second stage of the cycle of capital, which is the production of a commodity whose value exceeds the capital originally invested by the capitalist to buy the means of production and labor power, which is the first stage of the cycle of capital, that value is not completely returned in the salary, so that the excedent value, which derives from what Marx calls surplus labor, is accumulated in the form of private profit by the bourgeoisie when that commodity is commercialized in the market in the context of the third stage of the cycle of capital, whereby from value in the market regulated by the competition between capitals, a competition in which the capitals that have the most advanced technology and can produce a commodity in less or at time equal to the socially necessary time of production, extract what is known as extraordinary surplus value from those capitals with less organic capacity, that is, less technological development, and those capitals with less technological development produce commodities in more time than the socially necessary time of production. Therefore, the value of the commodities which they produce are assigned prices due to the law of price-fixing markets from value, which in the context of competition ends up enriching those technologically more developed capitals. And absolute surplus value implies that the time of work, the time of surplus labor, therefore, is increased so that the amount of value that is not returned in the salary increases in the form of private property accumulated as private profit by the capitalist. Relative surplus value implies reducing the proportion of the salary with regards to the technological development and how the technological development, which impacts the productive capacity of labor, in turn impacts the amount of value understood as human, undifferentiated and abstract labor objectified in a use value, in a commodity, which is an external object which, due to its properties, satisfies human needs, be they from the stomach or be they originated from fantasy, as Marx writes in the first volume of Capital. From absolute and relative surplus value, moving on to alienated work, which is a category which Marx first describes in his manuscripts of Philosophy and Economy of 1844, and here Marx takes the concept of alienation as exteriorization, which is how Hegel understands the concept of alienation. Hegel sees alienation as the exteriorization of the contents of consciousness, and Feuerbach, in his book The Essence of Christianity, is going to use that Hegelian concept of alienation to describe how the religious sentiment, the idea of God, is nothing but the exteriorization of the human sentiment, which implies the self-consciousness, again a Hegelian category, but expressed in an alienated form as that content of self-human consciousness is exterioriated in the form of the religious idea, or the idea of God, or in general the religious sentiment. Marx, in his manuscript of 1844, takes that concept of alienation as Hegel defines it and also as Feuerbach understands it, but this time he tries to link the exteriorization of the idea that the producer has in his mind and the productive activity through which a use value or a commodity is produced. Marx describes that there is an abyss, a rupture, between the idea that the producer has in his head and the material activity or the material process of production, whereby human labor is objectified in the productive process that leads to the fabrication of a specific use value. Marx also says in Capital that man differs from spiders and bees and other animals that can produce or seek their own means of subsistence insofar as man derives his material process of producing the means of subsistence from an idea which he cultivates in his head. The spider knits its spider web through its instincts, and the bees also, for example, are guided by their instincts, while man solely derives his process of production of the means of subsistence from an idea in his mind. But due to the private ownership of the means of production, due to the contradiction between capital as value in motion as a social relation of production, and labor in a market of wage slavery, he only has to sell his labor power and obtains a salary which does not return the totality of value which he produces during his time of labor, during his working hours, where he objectifies physical and mental effort in the production of a commodity whose value not only is not returned fully in the salary to the person who produced it, but whose production implies a rupture between the creative idea inside the mind of the producer, and the material process of production. We can see alienated work, of course, in the traditional proletariat who is working in the main centers of production, fabricating use values and commodities, but we can also see alienated work in the realm of modern-day industries, for example, the pharmaceutical industries, as well as some technological markets. We see that the scientists and engineers who work for these markets don't have the freedom to promote an authentic scientific and technological progress because, for example, the chemist, the doctor, the scientist who is hired by a pharmaceutical industry, they cannot freely materialize the idea of medicines, of alternative treatments that they can have from their research, from their theoretical knowledge of medicine, of chemistry and of science in general. They cannot freely apply that idea they have in their minds because what they have to produce needs to be in accordance with the interests of the particular bourgeoisie, capitalists, who own the industries in which they are working. So a doctor or a chemist who develops a new medicine or a new treatment for a certain illness has to accommodate his knowledge, subdue his theoretical production to the interests of the capitalists. The capitalists want to obtain profit from the surplus value they extract from the workers in the productive centers where the commodities that form their markets are produced. They also want to obtain extraordinary surplus value from the less developed, technologically speaking, capitals with which they compete in the market. And they also want to obtain profit by selling the commodities in the context of consumption, creating cycles of consumption where medicines, for example, are prescribed for life. The medicines which are prescribed for life, or the medicines which are prescribed even though there is enough theoretical knowledge to propose alternative treatments to certain diseases, to certain illnesses, doesn't matter for the capitalists because it is in their interest that the particular medicine which they have been producing, even though it's not effective, even though it causes side effects, even though it doesn't cure the illness, what they are interested in is selling that commodity. And as long as it sells, the entire productive process, which implies the application of science into technology, has to be subdued and orientated only to that objective which defines the interest of the capitalists: gain profit, be it through surplus value, be it through gain by commercializing and selling the medicine in the market. The capitalists are only interested in obtaining profit, and the way they obtain profit is by not developing science as it could be developed according to the real authentic needs of the majorities, but applying science technology explicitly according only to the interests of the bourgeoisie. What is the most profitable way of producing medicines? It is not medicines that are truly effective, but medicines that only cure certain effects of a given illness, but are sold massively. And better still, if those medicines have to be given for life, that is the dream of the capitalists in the pharmaceutical industries. If we think about the technological industries, for example, in a company like Microsoft or Apple, if an engineer is hired to work for Apple or Microsoft, the idea that this engineer might have in their heads of a new program, a new software, a new application, a new type of technological device is not freely objectified in the material process of production, because the material process of production obeys programmed obsolescence, first of all. Programmed obsolescence is where companies produce technological devices which are designed to last less time than they should in order to be replaced by a new generation of other technological devices at the high cost of worsening the global climate crisis, at the cost of the exploitation of third world countries, particularly Africa and Latin America, only to gain more profit. So the needs of the capitalists again force that rupture between creative innovation and the real theoretical progress of science from being articulated with a material process of production which truly reflects the complexity of the theoretical aspect of science. For example, in science there is enough knowledge to replace non-renewable sources of energy. There is enough development in nuclear physics and in other areas of physics to apply alternatives to petrol and coal. But why have they not been fully applied? It is because there are many capitalist markets which are based on the use of non-renewable resources, even though it is destroying the planet, even though it is unsustainable by all perspectives, not only from the perspective of the global climate crisis, but also from the perspective of crisis of capital, the periodic crisis where capital as value in motion is paralyzed, a crisis of superproduction like the one that took place in 2008. But despite all of these negative aspects of the use of non-renewable energies, they still keep using them and producing them massively because they only want to gain profit, even if it's at the cost of destroying the planet and worsening the life conditions of millions of people around the world. So therefore, absolute and relative surplus value, alienated work, not only in the proletariat, in the productive centers, but also in scientists, engineers, and researchers around the world who are not able to apply the full theoretical complexity and knowledge of science into technology, because technology is completely subdued to the interests of the bourgeoisie, which are not the interests of the majority, and which causes the destruction of millenary ecosystems, the worsening of the global climate crisis, and the worsening of the material exploitation of the resources of the third world, which are critical to avoid crisis of superproduction and to maintain the economy of the first world, which is based on the cycle of world accumulation of capital, which is neo-colonial in nature. The destructive application of science and technology into the war industry, how physics, chemistry, and biology are used to create weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, which can destroy most, if not all, of the life forms, complex life forms at least, on the surface of the planet. The use of science for the purpose of a pharmaceutical industry whose objective is not to cure diseases and to improve the life conditions of the majorities, but only to sell commodities which don't have a real use value, as they should, as they morally should, but they have a use value mediated by the interests, by the economic interests of the capitalists. The use of science for technologies where the devices and other commodities in the technological markets are produced with the purpose of imposing cycles of unsustainable consumption from the environmental perspective, where devices are produced in the context of programmed obsolescence. They are deliberately programmed to be damaged in less time than they could be produced to last. They use for science only to increase the amount of private property of the bourgeoisie could control the main markets today, while 9 million people starve to death every year. The tremendous wasting of the productive forces today developed in capitalism to produce commodities which we don't need but are ideologically imposed, to create weapons of mass destruction, to maintain a food industry which commercializes all types of foods, chemically and genetically engineered, which end up causing all kinds of diseases in the population, while millions of people keep on starving. Centralized control of the means of production, which implies that science is completely subdued to the interests of the capitalists, which are completely immoral, based on exploitation, based on the denial of a worthy quality of life, of the dignity and freedom of millions of people. We can say that we find ourselves today in a critical moment in history, and it is extremely important to recognize in certain authors like Marx and the critical tradition of the school of Frankfurt, philosophy of liberation, all of these critical horizons which denounce the contradictions of capitalism, both from the economic perspective and also from what Marx calls in the prologue to his contribution to the critique of political economy, the Überbau in German, which is the overstructure of culture, law, politics, and in general social consciousness. I would say particularly that Marx has a crucial importance today. The theory of value which Marx develops, which describes first of all capitalist exploitation in the form of absolute and relative surplus value in the context of the contradiction between capital and labor, and the theory of value which describes also how prices are formed in the market regulated by the competition between capitals from value, and that theory of value which explains how the periodic crises of capitalism take place. Also the concepts like alienated work, centralized control of the means of production, the notion that the political organization of modern day governments is the reflection of the economic contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, where we can add the analyses of a Foucault, of a Deleuze, of the disciplinary societies, of the societies of control, of biopower, of panopticism, etc., and the forms of ideological repression and assimilation that the School of Frankfurt describes, from Horkheimer to Marcuse's one-dimensional man, the exploitation of the third world through what the Marxist tradition of the theory of dependency and other Marxists like Samir Amin call the unequal exchange of commodities, whereby the technologically more developed capitals of the first world extract extraordinary surplus value from the technologically less developed capitals of the periphery of the third world, therefore impoverishing those capitals and forcing the bourgeoisie of the third world to overexploit the proletariat of the third world, therefore describing and accounting for the underdevelopment of the third world due to the impoverishment of the bourgeoisie, which then have to exploit even more the proletariat of Latin America, Africa. It is absolutely urgent today to transform that theory, that Marxist conception of capitalism, that critical analysis from social philosophy of ideology, politics and culture, into a praxis, into a political agenda against capitalism, a political agenda that is unified and guided by the theoretical understanding of how capitalism works.